So that got us thinking, what is the significance of these so-called gaps in stock patterns? Where to the up or downside? Who better to answer that than Katie Stockton? So it's come up already a couple of times during the show, Katie, but when we're talking about gaps, what is a gap?
So it's when the price either opens the next day, next week, higher than where it closed. And it simply leaves a vacuum of support or resistance on the chart. They're very, very common around earnings reports or just any kind of news, events, you name it. And they can be very informational and even tradable at times. I would say there are two types of gaps. There are breakaway gaps and there are exhaustion gaps. So there's a little bit of a trick to determine which is which. Oracle is a great example of what looked like a breakaway gap to the upside in response to earnings, but indeed the stock came right back within that gap in the very next day. And when you tend to see that sort of gap penetrated within a few days, that tends to be a countering indication, right? So it suggested then that the Oracle gap was indeed exhaustive. We've seen the same type of exhaustive gap from Microsoft in the past in response to its earnings report. So when you see it come right back into that gap up, that tends to be a negative development.
All right. You have identified some other names we want to really take a look at. Meta is one of them. We talked about Meta, but that's a big gap that we've seen.
It is, indeed. And this is a gap down, of course, on the chart. So this is a little bit different. So what we hope it's not, but it's looking like it might be, is a breakaway gap to the downside. So we haven't seen Meta come back into the gap from the earnings report, and that would be a better scenario, right? It would suggest that there's a vacuum of resistance to the upside. So we'll be watching the gap for Meta. We'll also be watching any earnings-driven gaps, including Amazon. Amazon had a gap up, and so far is holding that gap as support. So it depends on whether it's a gap down or gap up, and whether or not the stock trades back into that gap immediately.
So going back to Meta with the gap lower, what do you want to see? What kind of action do you want to see to make you believe that there's a shot that it will fill that gap?
Right, that it would be more of an exhaustion gap, right? That would be opportunity to counter trend Meta. So we want to see it inch back up into the gap. And by that, the day that it gaps down, it's the high print of that day that we want to reference, because that then becomes potential resistance on the chart. To the sort of flip side, if it was a gap up, we're looking at the low of that day, and that becomes a so-called potential support. So for Amazon, we want to see that support hold at the low print from the gap up day, and then we'll reverse that for Meta. We want to see that high print exceeded if we're interested in adding exposure.
I looked at, in Amazon, we have two gaps in the chart, and, Katie can speak to this, but you're setting up, given what we saw today, for what we rarely see, but one of these island reversals. So maybe you can speak to that.
So an island reversal is really an interesting pattern. We don't often see them, and you could argue that we actually have kind of a lot of them after today, right? Where you see a gap up, it proves to be an exhaustion gap in that the stock or security comes back in very quickly and then gaps down. It leaves a little floating consolidation phase, usually only days in the making, and it does tend to be a short-term negative development.
We've talked on this show about, if there's a big move in a stock, to just don't touch it for a bit. Technically speaking, does that make sense? Or is there a scenario in which you would just jump right back in?
Yeah, I mean,
gap?
if you see Meta, for one, come back up into its gap, that would be the impetus to say, okay, well, the gap was overdone. And we have seen that. Maybe that Wingstop chart's a good example of it, where we had a gap down into support, and then it filled it within days. Well, that's actually kind of intriguing.
Are there gaps on your radar that you're saying are looking promising at this point?
Yeah, I would say Amazon is the one to keep an eye on here near term, because that obviously has a market impact on sentiment as well. And it was a great earnings reaction, took out final resistance, lifted to new highs, left a gap in its wake. And as long as that gap-based support can hold for Amazon, I would say that's a positive.